On this episode, we're going to dive the wreck of a ship called the SMS Karlsruhe. It's a German World War I warship, and she's currently sunk in the far north of Scotland in the Orkney Islands. Well, why is there a German warship in Scotland? That's one of the pieces of history that we're going to explore in this episode, and I'll even share a 100-year-old conspiracy with you that maybe explains how it all happened. Coming up next on this episode of Submerged Stories. All right, so let's just dive right into it, and yes, pun intended there. This is the wreck of the SMS Karlsruhe. She was a light cruiser in the German Navy built in 1916. We're in about 80 feet of water here, and the wreck is about 360 feet long. So, well, smaller than other dreadnought battleships at Scapa Flow. Actually, this was one of my favorite dives. I think she gets overlooked because she's smaller than the big ships, but I actually liked the more manageable scale of the ship. You could really get in and understand the details of the layout of the wreckage. These flags, by the way, were left by other divers. They were not, and they're not authentic to 1919, but it really created a very cool effect. What I really liked, these are the 5.9-inch guns on the ship. What I really liked about these is that actually some of it's still so intact that you can actually read the German on the barrel of these guns, which, I don't know, was just really cool for me. It was a great way to really connect with, like, yeah, these were real pieces of machinery and pieces of war used by real people. You'll see that coming up right here. All right, so that's a little preview of the dive, and we're going to do more diving and see more of this wreck later on the video. But let's transition back now and talk a little bit more about the broader historical context that led to the scuttling of the German fleet in Scapa Flow. By late 1918, Germany is losing World War I. It's become increasingly obvious on both sides of the conflict, and the time has come to sue for peace. And so on November 11th, 1918, Germany signs an armistice. And if you are European, you probably still celebrate Armistice Day to this day. But an armistice is not a peace treaty. It's just a ceasefire so you can negotiate the actual peace treaty. The difference between an armistice and a peace treaty doesn't often seem like a big deal, but one of the terms of the armistice is that the German battleships and war fleet will be interned. Now, what does that mean, interned? It means that there will still be German sailors on the ships. It's not going to be a full surrender because, well, it's not a full peace treaty yet. You might be wondering, why would the Allies ever agree to that? And the answer is, well, thousands of people were dying by the day on the Western Front, and they didn't want a small technicality to hold up the ceasefire. Though this difference between internment and surrendering of the German ships will make quite the difference. The interned ships are supposed to go to a neutral nation, like Spain, but no one was dumb enough to wade into the middle of these peace treaty agreements. And so instead, the interned ships are ultimately handed over to the British. The German battle fleet is disarmed, and they sail into the main home port of the Royal Navy, which at this point in time is in, well, Scapa Flow. And we know from the fact that we're going to be diving German shipwrecks that the German fleet will never leave Scapa Flow again. The guy in charge of the interned German fleet goes by the name of Admiral Von Reuter, and he's got his work cut out for him. Morale is low on these ships. Not only has Germany just signed this armistice and in the process of negotiating a surrender, the Navy had mutinied a couple months earlier. The British won't allow them off of their ships onto land. They won't share their Wi-Fi password. They won't even allow them to have food from the Orkney Islands. The Germans are forced to transport food from Germany to Scapa Flow to resupply their sailors, and you can imagine that the produce isn't exactly fresh by the time it gets to them. Even more interestingly, the British are controlling the flow of information. Everyone else is finding out what's happening at Versaille in real time, but the newspapers are delivered to Von Reuter on a 4-day lag. That means that Von Reuter is not getting real-time updates on how the peace treaty talks are going. This will prove to be important later on. Cut to June of 1919. The German fleet has been interned for almost 6 months. They spent a full winter in northern Scotland. That's not very fun. And still, the peace talks are not complete, and in fact, they seem to really be dragging on. The Allies are demanding a huge amount of reparations from Germany. These are, of course, the famous reparations that will lead to World War II. Von Reuter is following in the news, and he can't imagine the German government could possibly accept these terms. The Allies are getting frustrated, and so they give the Germans an ultimatum. They say, if you don't accept these terms, including the reparations, by June 21st, then the war will resume, and you're in no position to fight it. Von Reuter knows this, and he knows that the very first thing that's going to happen on June 21st is his ships are going to be seized by the Royal Navy. He doesn't intend to let that happen. Here's where things get a little nuanced, and you got to bear with me on these dates. On June 17th, the Allies grant an extension of the deadline, and they say, actually, instead of June 21st, you have until June 23rd. But here's the thing. Von Reuter is getting his news on a 4-day delay because the British are not delivering his newspapers on a daily basis. This means that Von Reuter is not going to find out about the extension until June 21st, and June 21st was the initial deadline in the first place. He's not going to find out about the extended deadline in time. Really sets the stage for what's about to happen, huh? Picture this, the morning of June 21st. It's probably a crisp, cool morning in the Scottish summer. Von Reuter, for the first time in months, puts on his full dress uniform to the T's, walks out on the deck of his flagship, and contemplates the order he's about to give. How would you feel? He's about to order the sinking of a multi-decade-long project, the building of the German Navy. No doubt he was anxious. He's wondering, just how will the British stop me, and how successful will they be in saving this fleet? And then, as he's looking and scanning across the bay, he sees something incredible, almost unbelievable. The entire British fleet raises steam and sails out of the harbor, leaving the German captives totally unguarded. On the very morning that Von Reuter intends to sink his fleet, he is left 100% unattended by the British. I mean, this is absolutely incredible. On the day that Von Reuter intends to scuttle his fleet, the prisoners have been left in charge of the asylum. This is too lucky, almost too lucky to believe, but Von Reuter doesn't question his luck. He seizes his opportunity and he cables his fleet the order, execute paragraph 11, confirm. This is a coded message that has been pre-agreed upon by the German Navy as the order to scuttle. Just so you have a sense of the scale of what's happening here, this order is actually not given over radio, it's given visually, either by flags or by light signals. And it has to be passed, therefore, visually from one ship to another, a giant chain of telephone. The number of German ships in Scapa Flow, there's over 70 of them, is so big and they're so spread out that from the time that Von Reuter gives his first order to the time that the last ship receives the order, it takes almost a full hour to pass the order all the way down the line. The ships raise their Imperial German flags for the last time ever. The sailors open all of the seacocks, allowing water to flow in. They jam the interior doors so they can't be closed. They're stuck open, meaning that the water will flow freely, and any British that do get on won't be able to close the doors. It's going to be very hard to reverse this, and the ships, all of them, will start to sink. As the British figure out what's happened, they come rushing back into the harbor, but it's too little, too late. 52 German ships go to the bottom of Scapa Flow. They weigh more than 400,000 combined tons, and in modern terms cost more than $5 billion. How could this have happened? It is the greatest single loss of shipping by tonnage in one single event in world history, still to this day. And it happened all under the nose of the Royal Navy, who knew full well that this was a possibility, and who knew full well that all these ships were still manned by German sailors. I mean, how do you explain such a massive mess up? And of course, this is where my 100-year-old conspiracy theory is going to come into play, because what if it wasn't such an accident after all? Let's go back to Von Reuter's handiwork, the results of that order that sent those ships to the bottom of the ocean. What we're looking at here, actually really interesting, is the fire control center for the Karlsruhe. It was the armored conning tower, effectively, There was a top conning tower that you could steer from, but in case of actual combat, you would really very much want to be in that armored area. And what's cool is that although Von Reuter destroyed the ships, he actually created a home for many sea creatures. This ship is covered in thousands, if not millions, of brittle stars. Anyways, we're going to keep touring this wreck. I'll show you the rest of it and point out some interesting sights along the way with text. But I want to jump back into history and tell you a little bit more about why the British might be in on a conspiracy to help the Germans sink their ships. You see, at Versailles, the Allies had been making plans to divvy up the German fleet among themselves. And actually, this was a real source of tension internally among the Allies. The French, in particular, really wanted a piece of the German fleet, and the Americans and the Italians wouldn't mind a piece of that pie either. But for the British, well, things were a little more complicated. Remember, the British had the two-power standard. I talked about that in my Part 1 video. And so they want to maintain relative superiority, and any ships that go to other navies only weaken the Brits' relative position at the top. After all, keep in mind, the British do have the largest navy in the world, and in fact, they know full well they're not going to be able to afford to maintain their dreadnought fleet in peacetime. It's just too expensive and takes too many men. So the British are already thinking that they're probably going to have to shrink their fleet. The last thing they want to see is a potential rivals fleet like the French or the Italians or the Americans grow. It's only going to weaken their relative position. As far as the British are concerned, they'd rather see the German fleet sunken. Well, I think you can start to see, again, where this conspiracy is headed. All the Allies but one want to divvy up the German fleet, but the one exception happens to be the one guarding the German fleet. Anyone see means, motive, and opportunity in this situation? After the scuttle took place, the French actually did publicly criticize the British and hint that they might have orchestrated this plot. Publicly, the British were furious at the Germans and criticized them and castigated their government. Privately, however, was a different story. And internally, the admirals spoke to each other and said, here's from what one of the British admirals, Admiral Weymouth. He said, quote, "I look upon the sinking of the German fleet as a real blessing. It disposes once and for all the thorny question of the redistribution of these ships." So, that's the private thoughts. Now, to be clear, historians who are far better than me, and I'm just an amateur, have looked, and no smoking gun document proving a British conspiracy has ever been found. But, in my defense, Nicholas Jellicoe, and he's the grandson of the famous Admiral Jellicoe of World War I, so he's going to be biased in favor of the British, and even he has to admit that what happened on Orkney can only be described as extremely convenient. Talk about an understatement if I've ever heard one. My personal opinion, well, I actually think it's kind of plausible. On a conspiracy scale from QAnon, absolutely implausible, to Gulf of Tonkin, well, actually kind of true, I could really see this one being true. Personally, I'm willing to bet that if no documents have been found, then this was not a true conspiracy in the sense that it was down in writing. But I do think that the British admiral in charge of the ships that day, Admiral Fremantle, when he took his fleet out on exercise that morning, I think he knew exactly what he would find when he came back home that afternoon. He may have even gotten a gentle wink, wink, nudge, nudge from the boys back in London, telling him that it might be nice to give the Germans a little bit of privacy in these days leading up to the end of the war. Certainly nothing that would ever be written down for the record, but I think a little bit of plausible deniability built into there, but certainly I don't think he was that naive. For what it's worth, one Royal Navy captain later claimed to have warned Fremantle that if he did go out on exercise that day, that, quote, he would be likely to find no German ships afloat when he got back. Now, this came after the scuttling, so maybe it was just a guy, talking a big game. Hindsight's always 20/20. Or maybe it's evidence that Fremantle had been forewarned, and the thought was in his head that if he did leave that morning, he would solve a big thorny issue for the future of the Royal Navy when he came back. So there you have it. What I think is actually a rather fun conspiracy from World War I, one that I had never heard discussed before, and one that I actually think is quite plausible and could maybe even be true. The sinking of the German fleet by its own hands was pretty sad ending for the German Navy, but actually rather happy news for the local Orcadians. They would spend the next 50 years salvaging steel from those ships, which would really provide a huge boost to the Orcadian economy. And in fact, there's even a rumor, I can't verify this, but an urban legend that steel salvaged from those ships was used in NASA space shuttle projects. It was this salvaging effort, which is why there's now only 7 shipwrecks remaining in Scapa Flow for us to dive. But they are, of course, incredible wreck dives, truly world-class. But although I can't say enough good things about the shipwrecks, I also can't say enough good things about topside Orkney Islands. The islands are beautiful with really interesting culture and nature and, of course, history. And if you're a wreck diver or a history lover, well, then this is a place that needs to be on your bucket list. And let's be honest, if you've made it this far through this video, well, then that is you. That definitely describes you. And if you have those same kind of niche passions that I do, then please, and you like this video, well, then, give it a like. Let me know to keep making videos like this one, and let the YouTube algorithm know that this is the kind of good quality content that you want to see more of. Thank you for watching, and I hope I can see you again in a future episode of Submerged Stories. All right, bye.